very, very important book. It's a book described on the cover as a personal and social history in the Shadow of Polio, and it's published by Addison Wesley, which is located in many, many cities throughout the world. I've gone through the book, and I find the book to be very, very important, and I think especially important for people who have members of their family who are ill with some debilitating illness, such as, well, back in the 50s, polio, today AIDS, and any number of other illnesses. And I have a whole sheaf of interviews here, all the way from the New York Times to the San Diego Reader, and I'd just like to read a couple of excerpts about the book before we get into your interview. No statistic can account for the awe and dread that surrounded polio. What nearly everyone who grew up in the polio years or who was rearing a child then remembers was the fear that hung like heat in the summer air. Yes, it did. If you were there, a whiff of that fear and even that summer heat will come back to you in this excellent narrative. If you were not, you will want to read it to understand what we were all so afraid of. For while statistics alone can't tell the story, there was an epidemic of crippling polio somewhere in the United States almost every year from 1900 to 1956, a half century, more than a half century. And when it came into its full strength from 1942 to 1953, 60,000 Americans a year were hit by it. In your particular case, you were born here in Boulder in 1949.
I was.
And when you were just 4 years old, your mother came down with polio.
We were living in Arizona then.
You moved to Arizona. She died 2 years later.
Right.
A very beautiful woman. We have quite a few photographs in the book to look at during the course of the interview. And essentially you remember little or nothing about her from your childhood.
Right.
But later as an adult and as a writer, what led you to write this book?
What led me to write it was not myself the writer, but much more myself the person, the woman who in my mid-30s, what I didn't know about my mother and about polio and about my own family became more important than all those years of not knowing. She died 2 years after falling ill. We had moved back to Boulder, and she came home after rehabilitation to live up on University Hill, back in our own old home. And once she died, she disappeared from our family. She was never talked about. I didn't grow up hearing anything about my mother. I never heard anything like, oh, your mother would have loved that, or you do that just the way your mother did, or anything that gave me any clues about who she was as a person. And there are many reasons for that. Part of it...
I understand that your grandmother destroyed all photographs of your mother after she died?
Right. She destroyed all of the photographs of my mother ill, the pictures of my mother in her, on her rocking bed and in her wheelchair with a chest respirator. I've had no pictures. The ones that are in the book came from other people, other family members, and this episode that I write about in the book, my grandmother tearing up all of these pictures after my mother died, is the first time I heard this from my grandmother. I was very angry because I knew that she had ruined it, had destroyed something that was important to me, that I wanted to see, that I wanted to know about. And as I went further and further into the book and into the research about what polio did to my mother, did to other polio victims, what it did to families, and as I began to understand what happened in my own family, I saw that episode in a very different way. And also, a critical thing that happened in my life is that I became a mother myself, and I saw my grandmother as a mother, and my mother was her only child, and I can kind of imagine this scene of her soon after my mother dying, tearing up these terrible reminders of what had happened to her daughter. And I grew up in my grandparents' house then. My father abandoned my brother and me, and we moved basically just across the backyard to my grandparents' house and were reared by them. And a picture, a photograph that is in the book, a portrait of my mother from her high school years, hung in the house. And so that was there, and I always grew up seeing that, but I knew nothing about my mother. And one of the themes of this book is the forgottenness. I realized once I started looking into my family's history and into the disease that killed my mother and destroyed my family, that my mother and polio disappeared at the same time. And that theme of forgottenness runs through the book. And it's extraordinary to me today to think about something as profound as polio that was for a decade was on the front pages of newspapers. It was on the radio news daily in the summer. Newspapers ran daily and weekly tolls of people who had been admitted to the hospital with polio. Sometimes they listed the names of people, and certainly people who had died. So it was this polio watch every summer. And then it was gone. Once we had a vaccine, this country turned its back on polio and forgot it, although there were left millions of people who had been profoundly affected by it. Paralyzed, their families affected in big ways.
You see, having been born in 1930 myself, I grew up in a period of polio. I grew up during the FDR administration, and where we had the President of the United States for 12 years, actually, more than that, who himself was a polio victim. And I had friends who had polio, and this was the scourge of the country. We all worked for March of Dimes. We tried to help people. There were sanitariums all over. And the terrible thing, in addition to the fact that the mother passed away as a result of a very virulent form of polio, is that the very year she passed away was the year that first the Sabin and then the Salk and Sabin vaccines saved the lives of other people and eliminated the disease, at least from the United States.
When in the spring of 1955, the Salk vaccine was tested in a way that would never happen today, but school children all over the country were given the Salk vaccine as a test. No one knew for sure whether it was going to be safe and effective. The March of Dimes and certainly Salk himself, Salk was quite confident that it was safe and effective, but we didn't know for sure, and parents lined their children up to get this experimental vaccine. And that was in 1954 when my mother became ill herself with polio. A year later, in 1955, when the news heard around the world in huge headlines and with great fanfare, was this announcement that the trial of the vaccine indicated that that this was the end of polio, that you could now step up and get your vaccine and not worry anymore about polio. And at that time, my mother was in a rehabilitation center in Seattle. The March of Dimes, among the many things they did around polio, was to fund these centers to get people who had been stricken with polio rehabilitated in whatever way was possible for them. So the camera crews in Seattle from the television stations came onto the ward where my mother and the other patients were, and thrust microphones into their faces and said, "So what do you think now that there is a vaccine that's too late for you?" And the irony of this was certainly not lost on anyone who got polio in those years beyond 1954, and there were tens of thousands of them who did. And it's always interesting to me to imagine that scene as well. Apparently my mother was on television talking about this, and I don't know what she said, but I read an interview of another mother from the same center who was interviewed, who said how grateful she was that her own children and other children would not be affected by polio. So I imagine my mother had some similar thought, but I also imagine that it must have been very difficult to lie there as she did. And she was fully paralyzed. She was paralyzed from the neck down. She could not move a muscle below her neck, could not breathe on her own.
She was on an iron lung?
She was in an iron lung for about 8 months, and then moved from a hospital in Phoenix to Seattle, to this rehabilitation center. And the extent of her rehabilitation was to get her out of the iron lung and onto other more portable, more comfortable ways of breathing for her. And also what was tried with her, as with all other respiratory patients, was anything that could get them breathing on their own. And many could take a few breaths, maybe breathe for a few minutes. I met one woman who is still alive today and similarly paralyzed as my mother was, but about half of her diaphragm worked rather well. So she could actually go a few hours breathing, although she could move nothing else. But none of that was effective with my mother. And I describe in my book my effort to find out why that was so. And
if I can interrupt for a moment, the fascinating thing about your book is that you knew none of this as a child. In fact, you knew none of it until you were in your 30s.
Right.
And you had to go and research what happened to your mother in order to write about your mother, because you really were told nothing about her in your whole growing up period. What was your background? You had a degree in writing, or what?
I have a master's degree in journalism from the University of Kansas, and I had spent, I like to think that I spent a lot of years getting ready to write this book, and had a very nice journalism career along the way. I worked in New York after finishing my degree at KU as a magazine editor. I worked at Woman's Day magazine and then at Better Homes and Gardens. And when I left New York, I moved to San Francisco to freelance write. And that was in the, let's see, when was that? Late 80s, 87. And
at all this time, though, you had no idea that you were going to write a book about your mother or about polio.
No, I didn't. I wrote magazine pieces. I went to be a freelance writer when I left New York, and I wrote magazine pieces mainly for the women's magazines, and I loved doing that. And when I suppose it's hard for me to think of exactly what brought me to this search into knowing about my mother, but it's only that I reached a point in my life, which was in my mid-30s, where not knowing about her was more painful than anything I feared that I would find out.
You were
if
afraid?
I did know.
You had fear before you?
Oh yes.
Why?
Because I knew that my father was an alcoholic. I knew that I was going to find out things about my parents' marriage that were not ideal. And again, I had no idea I would put all of that in a book someday for anyone to read. But when I started this search, the levels of what I didn't know were amazing. I had no background as a medical writer, so I needed to educate myself in that way in order to do the research about polio, because I wanted to know about the disease as well as about my mother. I began looking for people who knew her, classmates of her at Boulder High, and tracked them down and talked to them about her. And the idea for actually turning all of this into a book came to me in a very clear moment, and it's a rare moment in my career as a writer. I normally think of myself as someone who works to get ideas. I read, I think, I explore to find ideas. And then here I was with my arms around a wonderful idea for a book, but I didn't know that. I thought I was doing all of this research for myself, to satisfy my own need to know. And it was right after I had moved back to Boulder in 1990. And I had bought an old house, Victorian, in West Boulder, and I was cleaning the bathroom and had a sponge in my hand, and the moment is very clear to me. It came to me as like a whole sentence in my head: you are going to write a book about polio and your mother. And I threw down the sponge and I said, what a great idea. And I went right into my office and actually got to work thinking of all of this research and thinking that I had been doing in a different way. And I've always thought it was kind of fortunate that we get these moments of inspiration, but it's hardly ever the whole story. And I think I'm happy that I didn't know that day that it would be 6 years before I would actually hold this finished book in my hand.
Well, you've got it in your hand now.
But I have it in my hand now.
And it's an excellently reviewed book. I've gone through it. I haven't read it word for word, but I intend to, because it's important to me. Of course, I've had lots of friends who've had bad diseases, Alzheimer's included. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very sympathetic and very important to understand what one goes through. But in your case, it's especially poignant, because here was something that was a family secret, in effect. As if there was shame involved, as if there was something wrong with getting sick.
Right.
And in the book you mention how people would think that someone had not been a good person, that's why they got polio.
Right.
Which today we know is an absolutely groundless idea. Right. But you were able to deal with this and to really go back into everything and find it out. I mean, the physical aspect of the research must have been very difficult. Where did you go to find these things out?
Where did I go? I went lots of different places. I did things like go back to the newspapers. I read newspapers from the New York Times, of course, but also I read a couple of years of newspapers around the time my mother was in Seattle at the rehab center. I read newspapers from Phoenix because that's where we were when she fell ill, so that I could get a sense of what kind of world she was in when she became sick. I went back into old medical journals to try to find out what scientists, physicians knew then about polio, what their understanding was of it then, and then I also read medical journals, current ones, to try to see what our understanding of polio is today compared to what they knew then.
But what about the personal things about your mother and her as an individual?
I interviewed family members and friends, as I said. My father was a great help to me. I interviewed him a lot, and we wrote letters back and forth. And I would write to him. For example, I remembered we lived in a low-income housing complex in Phoenix when my mother fell ill. And I remembered our apartment, but I wrote to my father and said, will you draw me a floor map so I can check my memory.
Got a floor plan,
a floor plan of our apartment to make sure that my memory of that was correct. And I asked him endless questions about it. And I've tried very hard to get the truth of it. And I remember early on when I was writing the book, someone who is both a fiction and a nonfiction writer, excuse me, read a portion of it that included a detail about something that my brother had said to my mother on the last Mother's Day we had with her before she became ill. And I was actually in a group of people, and he said, well, isn't this great? How Kathyrn so carefully made up this detail that helps illuminate this story. And I said, wait a minute, I didn't make this up. I'm a nonfiction writer. It's not my job to make it up. It's my job to try to tell the truth as best I can. So every little detail like that in the book is real. I mean, that particular detail came from a letter that I have that my mother wrote right before she became sick.
In addition to your own family's history and anecdotes, you deal also with the prominent people of the period, Sister Kenny in that whole thing, the March of Dimes. In effect, it's a social history. It's a history of the United States at that period in the early 50s.
Right.
And I think quite valuable from that point of view because we tend to forget.
Exactly. And as I got into this, I realized that there was this period of American history that was being lost, and and it was my effort in this book to recapture it, because, for example, David Halberstam wrote a social history called The 50s, and it's almost 800 pages of all kinds of detail about life in the 50s. And there's not one word about polio or about Sabin or Salk in it. And we have so thoroughly swept it aside. So I felt like it was my task, that this was something I could do that was meaningful to me, and also I hope would have a significant place in a library, to recapture that period of American history.
Well, various well-known writers and people who make statements that are quoted have said that the job of the writer, the primary job of the writer, is to capture their period, capture their time. And there's another quote that you use in the book. I think it's something to do with an axe to break the frozen sea of...
From Kafka.
What is the exact quote?
I don't know if I can do it exactly, but he says that a book should be an axe for the frozen sea inside of us. And I think he meant it for readers, that when you read a book, it should be the axe. But for me, it was writing this book that was the axe for the frozen sea inside me. And
you feel that you as a person, you feel that you're more of a person having done the research and written the book?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, I did something very important for myself also in writing this book, and that is that I gave myself a story. I gave myself a history. It's hard to explain to someone who, has grown up in a traditional kind of family. But I had so many gaps. I remember once when I was in graduate school at the University of Kansas, we were in a graduate seminar, and the professor said something like, your assignment's going to be to take the year of your, say the year of your father's birth, and do some kind of research paper around that year. And I had no idea what year my father was born in. And I really even had no idea that that was common knowledge to other people about their parents. I simply knew nothing about my parents. A little bit more about my father, because he, of course, was still alive.
You'd been raised by your grandparents?
I was raised by my maternal grandparents,
yes. I had a similar experience to the point. I was once teaching a course, and I asked the students to write about the most significant things that happened to them when they were in high school. And one of my students wrote that while he was in high school in 3 years in Los Angeles, 7 of his classmates had been murdered on the school grounds by other classmates.
Oh my God!
And he went on in great detail. And it's really amazing.
Right.
Someone once said that there are no dull lives, there's only dull storytellers. Well, in your particular case, you decided that you wanted to find out who you were and where you came from and all that, and I think you did an excellent job. Today we have AIDS, and we have as many people coming down with AIDS almost as we're coming down with polio, and I think the death rate is actually higher. And I think it's very important that people write about these things and put them into the history so that the future generations will know. Hopefully AIDS will be defeated as well as polio and smallpox.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, AIDS has been a very powerful reminder that we don't have the answers. And polio was the same way. In its time, polio came at a time when science and technology was just coming along, just coming into its own, and people were just baffled and horrified that science couldn't take care of polio. I mean, that it took a lot of years, it took decades to figure out how to stop polio.
It had been around though for thousands of years.
Oh yes, it's we don't know how long, but there are apparently some biblical references that indicate that polio was around that long ago. There are polio is unique in diseases that we know about in its ability to paralyze.
Now, the epidemics, though, basically are products of the 20th century.
Absolutely. The polio was around for thousands of years in an endemic way. It was pervasive. It was everywhere. And like many other viruses that we think of as childhood diseases, if you are very young when you come in contact with it, it's a less severe illness than if you are older, and that was very much the case with polio. So when polio was everywhere, and we were living with open sewers and that sort of thing, infants pretty routinely came in contact with the polio virus and were made immune to it. As we began to clean up our environment in this country, children got older and older before they came in contact with polio.
So an adult who got polio is
right.
much more severe than a child.
Yes, yes.
I'd like to go on for a long time. In fact, I'd like to put this book into a whole program, if I could, of hours. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important for people to see this book. Can we get a close-up of the book here? Okay, and to go and buy it and read it, especially if anyone in your family has some kind of a disease which makes them bedridden, wheelchair-ridden, or some other, incapacitates them in some way, to understand how important it is.
I think, although this book is very much about polio, what it also is about is loss and how we deal with loss, and it's about bending under the weight of very great loss. So
I want to thank you very much for coming to our show, and I hope that everyone who's, the right people read this book. I think it's good reading in any case. It's history, but it's very important because it shows a tremendous compassion and will help people to understand those who are ill and how to deal with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.